goes.
This is Rob Neyer, and you are watching the Break It Down show.
I wrote a tweet the other day, an X, and I said I still got Betts as the MVP. And boy, did people lose their minds. The most recent one was, "Tell me you don't know anything about baseball without saying you don't know anything about baseball." And look, I maintain that they will split the 1-2 vote. Maybe I'm totally wrong, but I think there's value in the fact that the Dodgers were, I don't want to say struggling, but they hadn't broke away, and they had a lot of problems with a load of problems to the future. And Betts says, "Hey, Skip, I play second base." And Hayward's like, "You know what? I'm going to be pretty good, it turns out, unexpectedly." And they got as hot as any team, and they caught up to. They didn't catch them all the way, but they caught up to the Braves pretty quickly. Okay, there's value there, right? And who owns that? Partly Freddie, partly the front office, partly Doc, but a whole lot of Mookie. And when you look at their raw numbers, they are very similar in a lot of areas. And when there's not parity, there's like Mookie owns this, Acuna owns that, and yes, the stolen base thing is there, but I don't think that's an undefensible position that Betts is the most valuable player. Of course, I also believe that you don't have to have. I believe that the Hank Aaron Award is different than the MVP.
This is a subject that is near and dear to me because I've spent so many years hashing through all the different arguments, right? And I would say that my thinking evolved, but I always go back to something that I learned before my thinking evolved. When I worked for Bill James a long, long time ago in a state far, far away, Bill wrote a few books that were basically, they were just player evaluation. That was it. They were designed for the fantasy crowd. They weren't designed for the wider baseball history community. They weren't designed for Bills fans particularly. They were just designed as a book where you could go and say, okay, Bill says this guy is going to be better than this guy next year, so I'm going to draft him first. That was the whole book. And I think it was in one of those books where Bill wrote 2 words, and they've stuck with me ever since. And those 2 words are everything counts. We still haven't gotten there in the analytical community. And I don't mean people who do sabermetrics, although you could say that about these folks too. But you remember how many years ago was it where we had the big Miguel Cabrera, Mike Trout controversy, right?
Yeah.
Everybody said, well, half the people said, you have to give it to Mike Trout. His WAR is the highest. His stats are the best. The other half, roughly, at least among voters, actually the voters wasn't half and half. They went for Cabrera. They said, but he won the Triple Crown.
Yeah.
That has to be your MVP. I think that you and I would agree that if that balloting happened today, it would probably go the other way. Trout would probably win, right? But one of the things that I hope I wrote at the time was would have been, let's not just look at that dichotomy, best raw stats versus Triple Crown. Let's dig a little deeper. Let's look at their defense. Now that would be included in wins above replacement. So that doesn't come. Let's look at a stat called, one version called WPA, which is how many wins you've added to your team, not based on what your raw overall stats are, but when you got those stats, right? Why would you not count that for an MVP? Because you're absolutely right. We have other awards. We have other metrics that tell us who the best hitter was on a per plate appearance basis, right? That's an interesting thing to know, especially if you're doing a projection.
Yeah.
Because that guy's probably going to be a more valuable hitter next year. The question we're trying to grapple with is who's been the most valuable player, and we can measure value in many different ways. But I think most people would start with how many wins did you bring to your team? And if these 2 guys have the same stats, but this one hit 450 with runners in on base, and this one hit 320. I'm going to guess the 450 guy brought more wins to his team. You don't know for sure. It's likely. So what I would say is, yes, count defensive versatility. That's a really important thing.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Have we figured out a way to precisely measure the value of that? No. We know it's worth something. I think we would all agree that it's worth something. So the problem with everything counts is then you have to figure the next 2 words or the next 3 words for how much. But to me, if you have 2 guys who are pretty close with the things that you can easily measure or look up,
Right.
then you start looking for tiebreakers, right?
Yeah.
How good a teammate is he? How versatile was he on defense? Et cetera, et cetera. And I can come up with a dozen of those things if we need tiebreakers. So I don't know what the answer is in this particular case. I'm fairly certain that you can't. It's closer than a lot of people might think, especially Acuna fans.
There's I want to get into the stolen base part of it first, but I want to go back to the story because the story does matter and there's value in that. And I think the best example of this, where it's just like the one moment where you look and you go, yeah, that's the guy, is Kirk Gibson in '88, where Jesse Orosco puts eye black in his hat. He realizes it. He leaves the field and destroys a toilet. And he's like, and I'm going to swear here, he's like, you motherfuckers better get in line. We're not here to fuck around. We're here to goddamn win. And that's it. That team that was going nowhere the previous 2 years and we're struggling to go anywhere. This is a guy that kills in the World Series. He's like, this is not how we do this. And I'll be damned. You know, that team that should not have won, he gets all the credit now for hauling them there. And when they needed something, he didn't belong out there in game 1. He barely plays the next 2 years. I know he played a little bit, but he was so broken.
Right.
He had one moment. It really was the last time he could stand in front of a team as a leader. And he bombed that ball, and he had no business being out there. That is the MVP. Sure, Hershiser had a higher WAR that year. No one's going to take that year away from him. But that MVP that year started in spring training, and you had to catch Kirk Gibson and know what he did.
Well, it's a funny thing because you are absolutely right. That is why Gibson was named the MVP that season. You could make a similar case for a couple of years later, Terry Pendleton comes in, supposedly anchors the infield, wins I think he won the award that year. And the funny thing about those 2 guys is that if you actually drill down into the numbers, you can make an actual statistical case for both of them because of their defense. And in Gibson's case, he had a really good season. It's not it isn't on its face a great season statistically, but when you look at his defense and you look at his home ballpark, he actually would be way up there even without. But that is not why he won. He won because of the reasons you mentioned, and I don't have a problem at all. I've never had an issue with the MVP being a story stat or story award, as long as your story, I think, is important enough. In those 2 cases, again, tiebreakers.
Yeah.
To me, the eye black, if I needed it, would be a good tiebreaker. Same with Pendleton anchoring the defense and bringing that stability to a team that had been so poor the year before. So, there are other story MVPs that I've never bought into. Justin Morneau, for example. I've always thought that, and I could be wrong about this, but I have thought ever since then that the reason that Morneau won, and I apologize for not remembering what year it was, is that sometime in September, Jason Stark, who had a huge reach at that point, probably still does, but had a bigger one then, I think, because there wasn't the internet wasn't as fractured and diverse as it is now. So everybody read Jason Stark on ESPN.com. Jason published this story about the Twins' record over the game since whatever it was, May 18th or something, how many RBIs Justin Morneau had since that date and their record. He put these two things together: their record, Morneau's stats, and the record was incredible and his numbers were incredible. And I think that's why he won the MVP. I thought it was a terrible argument. I couldn't say as much then because he and I were coworkers.
Right.
But I might have alluded to it, but I thought it was a terrible argument because what about the games before then when they didn't play well and he wasn't playing well? Do we just not count those games? It never made any sense to me. So I think that story awards are really interesting, and I'm still waiting for someone to write a great book about the history of the MVP where they go back and sort of look at the news coverage, because that's how a lot of awards have been won over the years. You go look at the stats 30 years later and go, that doesn't make any sense. Yeah, go back and look at what the writers were saying at the time, and suddenly those awards make a lot more sense, probably. Not saying that justifies them, but you can understand what happened.
The other thing, too, is there's different kinds of MVPs, and that book doesn't have that typing, like Eckersley wins the award. Is that a story or is it dominance?
Right.
There's just like sometimes there's, I think it was 2001 where Larry Walker went bananas and Barry Bonds went bananas and Pujols went bananas. All these guys had these outsized years. And how do you pick? I mean, even this year, Freddie Freeman has had a fantastic year,
right.
But whatever reason, his numbers don't resonate. And so you pick the one. And so what is the differentiation? And is it a story so there's a wide variety of numbers.
Well, Willie Mays could have won 10 MVPs.
Oh my God. Yeah.
But
right.
The writers weren't going to give it to him every year. It was too boring. So they'd go to try to find somebody else who was not as good as Willie Mays, obviously, but hey, he had a good year. We got to give it to somebody else this year. So we'll give it to that guy. But there are a lot of those out there too, where the writers just sort of didn't want to give it to the same guy every year.
Yeah, that's like the Barry Bonds Award, right? They're like, we're just going to give it to somebody else.
Yep.
They don't call it the Barry Bonds Award now, but Miguel Tejada comes to mind too, by the way. When the A's rip off 20 in a row, he seemed to be the guy that hit the home run that made the difference. And that is valuable, when you're watching that. And it doesn't resonate as well because it's on the West Coast, but there he was like, and the home run to go ahead is Miguel Tejada. Maybe it happened 4 times in the month, but if it kept that streak for 20 going, it tells a great story, and that has value. So I want to get into this stolen base thing. So, all 3 of the new big rules for baseball foster an environment for more offense and for more stolen bases, and it has benefited Acuna. Do we know what the value of a stolen base is? He is caught 13 times. The last time I looked, I don't know about last night, but 13 and 70 is, that's not bad. It's not great. It's probably fringy, I guess, but that was for the old way. So what are your thoughts on that? And how valuable is that compared to, what we see Betts doing at second base and a little bit of shortstop?
Well, all those pieces should be measured pretty darn accurately by wins above replacement.
Okay.
The stolen base rate, the stolen bases, the caught stealings, Betts' defense, not his versatility. That's sort of a separate thing, but its actual contribution on the field, playing the infield. Those are all there. And I meant to look before we talked. I meant to see how those two guys' WARs compared. Certainly, Acuna's stolen base rate, that's really good, actually. 70, 13 caught. Our old rule of thumb was you had to be successful 70% of the time, or you were actually a net negative.
Okay.
And obviously, a lot of that's conditional. We go back to when did it happen in the game? Was it a meaningful stolen base or not? When you steal 70, there's a pretty good chance that they're not. They can't all be meaningless in the 8th inning of a blowout, right?
Right.
70 and 13, that's really good. That's better than Rickey Henderson's percentages, at least in the years when he was stealing a lot of bases. And that percentage, the break-even percentage, it fluctuates based on what's the broader context of baseball and the run production, but it doesn't fluctuate that much. I remember when I was first looking at baseball numbers, I think Bill James wrote that it was around 67%. And then it got to low 70s when everybody was hitting home runs. But that's not that big of a difference, right? The real answer is that at what is 70 and 13, that's something like, it's probably like 82, 84%, somewhere in that range.
Yeah.
You're not adding a lot of runs to the general environment. I would guess that he's probably added, I don't know, half a win. Half a win is half a win is 5 runs. So that sounds reasonable. He might have added 5 runs by stealing.
It's funny. I think to the moment that there was a 5-run difference between the two of them in terms of runs scored.
Okay. Well, so I just mean like, well, yes, that's a whole. So individually, I don't know what that would add, but to your team environment, you're adding. He might have added somewhere between, I don't know, 4 and 6 or 7 runs. I mean, it sounds like I'm just making stuff up, and I am, but the numbers are small enough where you can make them up basically, and you're probably about right.
Right.
So, and how many steals does Betts have?
He doesn't steal bases, and there's a question there is like, why doesn't he? If it's so easy, why doesn't he steal bases?
Yeah,
and
it is a good question.
He did have
about as fast as Acuna, right?
He had a hip problem that he didn't get operated on a couple years ago and had a number of cortisone shots on. And so my guess is that they're like, do everything else great. Let's not worry about stolen bases. Because look, that's just a viable thing. He's a hip slider, and so he's not a head first guy. And that's my guess. Look, I have no inside knowledge. I probably could ask a couple people that I know that work at the Dodgers and see. They probably wouldn't tell me because that's.
Well, and by the way, one thing that we can look up now that we couldn't look up 10 years ago is how fast he actually is.
I know, right?
Because we have the metrics. We can anybody who wants can go to Baseball Savant and look up his sprint speed. So, and we can also look up how many runs. We can look up somewhere else how many runs he's adding on the bases aside from stolen bases. First to third, all that kind of stuff. So it really is, and all those things, not sprint speed per se, but all those things like taking the extra base. The things that people love to say, oh, they don't show up in the box score. Well, not the box score, no, but they do show up, and we can look them up, and they can and probably are being factored into those overall wins above replacement esque metrics. And by the way, I just so you know this, I don't live and die with wins above replacement. It's just like everything else. It's a tool. As I said, everything counts. And you can put a lot of things into that, and then that makes the rest of the everything counts a little easier because you have fewer other things to like versatility. How good a teammate is he? That sort of thing to look at.
Yeah, and when at some point, I don't have a sense for this. I'm sure you have a much better sense. Are you like, oh my God, we are just so deep into like, this is first percentile stuff. Like, this is not what matters. Like when we look at the slashing numbers, it's like, well, Acuna's ahead of all of them. Like, yeah, his OPS is 1,002, and Betts is 992. Like. There's not really a difference there, right? We're talking about things that tomorrow, one hit in one direction is still not going to end of the season. They're not going to finish that far apart. Right. So when you look at WPA or some of these other stats at this time of the season, it just kind of is what it is. And so if they're close, they're just close. And is that a tie? What difference are we trying to look for here? And
well, have you looked up WPA lately?
Not off the top of my head. I have looked it up lately, but it's not sitting in my head. I'm looking up sprint speed right now for Mookie Betts. He's 27.3, so he's squarely average.
Average? No, that's surprising for a guy.
Yeah, it is surprising. Yeah, but I think he runs the bases well for some reason or another. I think he has a good sense for that. I think that's his thing, which I'll try to figure that out here in a second.
Well, I'm going to look up WPA because that is one thing that can vary quite a bit. Even among great players.
His speed to first base is 4.47, by the way, which is it's not slow. That's pretty fast. One of the things, as you look that up, I'll vamp and talk a little bit about versatility. One of the arguments I like to get into is like talking about value over the course of a career. Like Derek Jeter is one of the most important shortstops ever. And you can make a case that he's the greatest shortstop because he played the most games there. If you were talking about, if you're measuring greatness among greatness, and you went out and you played 20 years, and he plays 90% of all Yankee games at shortstop during his career.
Mm-hmm.
That means that nobody else, for the most part, had to play shortstop during his career. You could employ somebody that had other skills and was just gonna, fill in on every other Sunday or whatever it was. There's enormous value in that. When we look at Brooks Robinson, he plays, I think, 600 more games than Mike Schmidt. If you're going to put them into a machine and you said play for 20 years, well, at some point, Mike Schmidt, right around 15 seasons, he runs out of greatness. And so his last seasons would be 0 for 4. Every ball that went by a third base, there'd be no one there. It would not be an out, right? And so that WAR would go, and it would shrink down, right? And so that, or like Lark. You have to attach Pokey Reese. It's like almost perfect. All right, I think I'm back. Nope, am I back? Yeah. You have to add Pokey Reese to Barry Larkin to equal Derek Jeter's career, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's value in that. The value, and look, you don't know this in the forward, but you know it in retrospect. Like that's how valuable Derek Jeter is he's Derek Jeter for 20 years. Brooks Robinson is Brooks Robinson for 23 years. Not every year is great, but there's a number of great years that are greater than Mike Schmidt's great years. And so that versatility, that durability, we don't tend to see that in value, but there it is. There's Mike Schmidt playing 600, I think, less games at third base. When you look at the greatness, I'm not saying Mike Schmidt's not incredible. He is. But being able to show up and play the game, being able to hold down your position or multiple positions, like it drives people crazy, but Kike Hernandez has more defensive value than Keith Hernandez because of what he does on the field.
Right.
What did you find out about WPA?
So clutch-wise, Acuna's been significantly better than Betts, which which isn't to say that he's been a lot more valuable overall. It just means that in clutch situations, Acuna's been better. Bryce Harper's been way better than both of them, but his overall numbers aren't as good. But in terms of WPA, your top guys are basically the ones you would expect because they have the best numbers. So even if they're not great in the clutch situations, they're so good in all the rest of the situations they add a lot of value.
Right.
But like a lot of things that we don't have a clear answer about in terms of which one was actually the more valuable player. They're just another couple pieces of the puzzle. But they've both been tremendous. Acuna's been a little better. Just looking at WAR, Betts is actually a little bit higher, and probably because he has that defensive value. Again, that doesn't even include the intangible value of his versatility. How much easier does he make his manager's life that he can play because he can play second base? Yeah. I've always had this sort of hazy concept of something called organizational capital or energy. Every single person in your organization requires a certain amount of energy, right? This guy's a problem. You have to spend X number of minutes on average every day making sure he can get through the season without having some sort of issue. You've got to spend this much time. Your hitting coach has to spend this amount of time with this guy every week to keep him on track, right? Every player, everybody that works for you requires energy. But some guys make your life easier. If you have a player who does a lot of the takes on a leadership role, that's time that you can spend doing something else to make your team better. Mookie Betts makes Dave Roberts' job easier because he doesn't have to worry about who's going to play second base. He has this all-star who can jump in and play second base, which opens up other things. So, again, I like, and as much as I've complained about award voters over the years, I like having human beings be a part of that process because frankly, I like having these conversations. And if human beings aren't having that conversation, there's no reason for me to have the conversation. Anybody can design an algorithm that spits out the MVP every year, but who cares?
Right.
We don't need that. You
Yeah.
and I could build those if that's all we want. If that's what we want, it's more fun to talk about these things and go back and forth. As long as we can have some, the times I've gotten frustrated over the years with people is when we couldn't agree on some basic concepts.
Mm.
I had a conversation one time with somebody about Omar Vizquel and his suitability for the Hall of Fame, which to me should be for great players. And this guy said, well, he's clearly a Hall of Famer because he won these Gold Gloves. And he said, well, and I said, well, yeah, but you're a baseball writer. You guys never, the writers never thought he was a great player when he was playing.
Right.
He never came close to an MVP award. So, which is what you do with players you think are great players. So why was he not a great player then? Now you're arguing that he is a great player. And we could never come to agreement on that argument. So I didn't really know, I probably said this to you before, but somebody once said you can only argue with people with whom you fundamentally agree. So I like to have a baseline where, yeah, we agree that this is important. This is important. Yeah. This is something of value. Then we can talk about the details. And for a long time, there have been a lot of voters where you couldn't even agree about agree on the details about. I think now we've gotten to the point where most of the voters for the awards sort of agree that these are the important things. Now it's just a matter of weighting them.
There's another thing too, and we'll just use WAR as an example because it's a good universal stat. And there's a lot of critique about WAR, so we'll just set that aside. But it's a number that makes sense in most cases. And if you aren't sure and you need tiebreakers and you need nits to pick, I would submit that taking Acuna and taking Betts and saying, okay, let's look at the team and the WAR stack. And look, the Braves have not had as challenging a year as the Dodgers. We find out Will Smith played, I don't know, half of the year with a broken rib, and how many guys lost an elbow tendon on that team? You got
didn't,
a guy that's...
Didn't the Dodgers, didn't they lose their entire starting rotation at one point?
Yeah, and then some, right? Because Pepio didn't even start the year until just recently, and he was going to start. And Gonsolin pitched with a torn ulna, collateral ligament, because they're like, we don't know. He's like, I'll just pitch. It's already torn. I'll just keep pitching, right? And so you have all of these things, and it's like, I believe that there's value in being a steady presence. And so when you look in there, and I just did this, I haven't done this until now, but you look in their WAR stack, look, the Braves have a lot of talent around. It's just like the old thing with with Big Papi and Manny, right? Those two guys were always MVP caliber guys, but they just couldn't get out of each other's way enough to stand out. And so they pulled each other back, and then other guys went forward because, God, look at all that talent around them, right? And it's how do you become valuable? And some people say that that's not how you define valuable, and we struggle with what's valuable, but there is something to be said for the distance between you and, say, like the fifth guy or the third guy. And this is what Pete thinks in the WAR stack. And it's not the ultimate answer, but it is a way to try to see where the value is.
Well, yeah, I agree with all of that. And where I have an issue with wins above replacement, it's not in the statistic or the metric itself, metrics, because there are different versions. It is when I don't think this happens as often as detractors like to suggest, but there certainly have been award voters, who essentially look at the list and just go do on their ballot for both Cy Young and MVP, Rookie of the Year probably as well. And to me, that's just about, it's better than what they used to do, but it's not great, right? Because if you have a guy up here with 8.2 WAR and the next guy in WAR is 7.5, I'm sorry, 0.75 wins over the course of 6 months, that does not get it done for me, right? That might be where their value really was. Yeah. But to me, if you're just going down a WAR list for your ballot, you shouldn't have a ballot.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be that easy.
Yeah.
You should have to put some work in and do some research, figure out those other things, count as many things as you can count. I never had a ballot. I was not. I was a member of the BBWA for 3 or 4 years, but in my region there were enough other voters that I didn't wind up getting a ballot one of those years. I like to think that if I had one, I would have put a couple of days into it. But I don't know for sure. Maybe I wouldn't have put the work in, but I do think that if you're going to have the ballot, you should put in the work and make that distinction, because one win or 1.5, or you can draw a line wherever you want. Certainly, anything less than one win on that list, to me, that's almost the same as zero.
Yeah.
Because 6 months, think about that. One win in 6 months.
Yeah.
It is almost zero. It really is.
Well, when you factor in luck, it's less than zero.
Right.
Like it really is. So just out of curiosity, the season isn't over yet, but have you decided on who you think the MVP is for the National League?
No, I haven't. No, and I won't, because my job doesn't require it anymore. My old job, I had to write about these things, and I would not spend days, I will be honest with you, going 1 through 10, but I would look at the top 2 guys and try to do a pretty good job when I was writing about it. And I enjoyed that exercise. A lot of years it was pretty obvious. Some years it wasn't. I think that in this particular, those 2 guys, just looking at my very brief lookup on Fangraphs just now, they're close enough where you could make a great case for either one of them. I really think that trying to just look at a few numbers and go, oh yeah, it's got to be Betts because of this. Sometimes I think what happens is it's so hard that we just make a decision that I'm going to vote for this guy because of this. His versatility, his ability to play second base. That's the tiebreaker. And it's not the wrong answer. Mm-hmm. I would probably try to find a few more tiebreakers and then kind of, but there are people out there who are going to look at a voter who voted for Acuna or who voted for Betts, and they're going to go, he is obviously wrong. That was stupid. He shouldn't. Yeah. How could he possibly have done that? Well, I'm here to say that nobody's smart enough to know that either one of those guys is the wrong choice. I actually think that the American League might be more interesting because there aren't even 2 clear-cut guys.
I had purposely not brought them up because I don't know yet. I don't know.
I mean,
and also there's no one from the Brewers who stands out to me as being like their person, and it's hard. I want to get into the Oakland A's situation because again, like we have all of these great fans from the Bay Area, and this story is a saga. And of all of the teams that have got all of the stadiums, and I'm even going to include Tampa Bay, who kind of maybe has a stadium solution figured out. We've been down this road a couple of times, so maybe it'll go back. But the A's have had the hardest situation, and Oakland has lost, well, now it looks like probably 3 major franchises.
Right.
And there is a group of fans that just are, they're just not having it. And I don't blame them. It sucks. But when you look at the whole thing, and I don't know how savvy you are with the multi-decade thing with the A's, but I don't know how this could have turned out any other way. Back when the Giants were hanging on to the Bay Area by a thread, there were a couple of things that happened. The owner back then was a guy named Lurie, and he was sick of it. He's like, no one shows up. I can't make money here. We're stuck in Candlestick. It sucks. No one likes it going there. And it was way harder to get to Candlestick than it was to get to the Coliseum. So fans almost by default would just go to the Coliseum. And the team was terrible. And so people went to the Coliseum because the A's were better, more likely than not. And then Will Clark went bananas. Jeffrey Leonard went bananas in the 87 ALC or NLCS. And that kind of tipped it. Those teams were getting good. And then 89 happened, and there was some belief, and things started to turn the tide. But they were still going to leave. When they were going to, this guy named Vince Namoli, I believe I say his name. They bought the team, and they're going to go to Florida. And then it became real for San Francisco. and everybody started pulling on that rope to save the team, and they did. And part of that deal was Oakland ceded the San Jose rights to the Giants,
Right.
and that turned out to be a mortal wound. So anyhow, I don't know how much you know about all this, but what are your thoughts on Oakland and going to Vegas? And Vegas isn't a bigger market, but it is a world-class market. So I don't know. What do you think?
A lot of thoughts, few of which are fully formed. But I would say this. There's a long history of owners of sports teams trading on civic spirit and pride, and then jumping ship when it became convenient. And I would argue that fans are legitimately upset when that civic pride turns out to mean basically nothing. It's not clear to me that the A's current owner has any affection whatsoever for the market or the fans of that team. And I think that it's fair to be upset about that. This is not the first time something like this has happened. I mean, we can go back to obviously the Dodgers and the Giants.
Yeah.
Both of those teams had perfectly valid reasons for leaving. The Dodgers couldn't get help with the new ballpark that they wanted in a place where they wanted it. I don't even remember the Giants having, when I say remember, I don't remember reading about the Giants even having an option. The Dodgers did have Robert Moses proposed a stadium, a new at where the Mets play now, basically on public land, an old dump, landfill. I don't remember the Giants even having any option.
I don't think there was, yeah.
But, you know, in retrospect, was there land somewhere where a new ballpark or two could have been built that would have been served those teams well? Sure, of course. But California beckoned, and it worked out wonderfully. Not for the Giants so much in the short term. In the long term, clearly, yes.
Yeah.
Then, and you could argue now, the problem for fans of teams that move is that baseball limits the number of teams in the league. So, you know, if private enterprise could have put a couple teams in California, the Dodgers and Giants wouldn't have moved. They would have had to have stayed and figured something out, right? If there were teams, right? If there were already teams in Las Vegas and Nashville, wherever else could support Major League Baseball right now, the A's wouldn't have a choice. They'd have to stay and figure it out. But, you know, none of this is new. Doesn't make it less frustrating. What changes are the models. You know, back in the 50s, what was attractive were these new markets, these huge markets in San Francisco and Los Angeles, clearly that could support Major League Baseball. We're thirsty for it. What's happening now isn't so much that there are these big new markets, because frankly there aren't. Las Vegas probably isn't a great market. Doesn't mean they can't support a major league team. You never know until you try. Same with Nashville and Portland and the others that have been talked about. What's happening now is that baseball owners, they don't see great new markets. They see great new, what do you call that? What do you call these now? Mixed use developments or whatever they are?
Yeah.
Condos and hotels and restaurants. And oh my gosh, and I can own a piece of that? Well, sure, I want that.
It's like a Wrigleyville. You want to have their own little Wrigleyville.
Right.
That's manufactured around the Royals. Like that's the new Royals proposal, right?
And even Wrigleyville isn't Wrigleyville anymore.
No.
They have the shiny new buildings too.
Yep.
You know, that, well, I mean, now I'll sound like an old fogey, which I am, but I like the old Wrigleyville better. I like the old bars and the old apartment buildings and the old firehouse, which is still there, granted.
Yeah.
But a lot of things aren't there anymore. You're right. The Royals, the Royals have this amazing ballpark that got $100 and some $1 million renovation 8 or 10 years ago. They want to move so they can have the new thing, the ballpark village or whatever you want to call it. And that's what the A's want in Las Vegas or wherever they wind up, or even if they stayed in Oakland, that's what they would have gotten eventually.
Yeah.
That's the new model.
Yeah.
Doesn't appeal to me personally, but that's where the money is. And teams have always followed the money. That has stayed consistent since 1957. What's changed is the way to make that money.
Yeah.
But the basic impulse to follow the money and ignore whatever civic pride might exist, that's not new.
I think part of the thing is the Yankees can create their own sport network, and they've got a whole different machine. The Dodgers are the drawingest team, whether it's home or away. These guys have different problems, and getting folks to come in and spend money, it's just not one of them.
Right.
But if you're the A's, even the Giants to some degree, you've got to figure out how to do that. And if it is this mixed use thing, okay. And the problem that the A's ran into was they were just in this problematic market where, look, if they could have moved to San Jose in the mid 90s, I don't think they move. I think that they're good, but that market wasn't going to do that. And I'm going to be critical to my brothers and sisters in California. We are great at taking a problem and putting 15 problems in front of that problem and making it untenable. And so maybe the A's would have had a great offer in 6 months, but they ran out of time, and Major League Baseball has played this game for decades. And so you're right about the owners. And I don't blame the Haases for being fed up. They sold that team at a market loss. They made money, but they sold it at a depressed value because it's hard to make money there. And they wanted to keep it in Oakland.
Right.
And then when Schott and Hoffman sold it, they're like, we sold it to guys that are going to try to keep it here. And they tried to keep it there. They tried Fremont. They tried San Jose. They went to the Supreme Court. They got told no. Just recently, the other day, again, Supreme Court's like, nope, we're still not going to hear any case about any rights for San Jose. And they just, so it is a hard place to figure out what to do. And even like all of the developer people, when they look at Howard Terminal, which would be this idyllic, pretty spot for a stadium, they're like, oh, how you're going to do that money-wise? It's billions of dollars. And then again, it's California. So we're going to have 1,500 little mini problems around it that are going to make it cost more and more. We can't even build a train in our Central Valley. It's like we have all these things. Right. And so I don't know what the A's could have done, but they didn't do. And it's frustrating for them. It's frustrating for the fans. It's frustrating for the city. It's frustrating for Alameda County. I'm sure Sacramento, which is now a massive area, a huge DMA in its own right, I'm sure they would have loved to have tried. It's just ran out of time. And I don't blame Major League Baseball for being, we can't even grow because we can't get the A's to be viable. So we're going to send you to the biggest city in the world. And then one thing, this was what resonates with me, Rob, and then I'll shut up, is when you look at Oakland, they've lost the Warriors, the Raiders. There used to be attached to that parking lot a little thing called Malibu Grand Prix. And you can get in your little race car and you can drive around. Super fun. Couldn't stay in business there. Nothing has filled that 9-acre lot since then, 20 years, right? So nothing is in Howard Terminal since they closed that thing down. Nothing wants to go to Oakland. Oakland is a problematic city. I don't know how they get back on their feet. Vegas in the last couple of years has added the Raiders. They've added the Golden Knights. Formula One didn't pick Oakland. They picked Vegas. MSG Group built the Sphere there, and they're opening it with U2. U2 hasn't been in Oakland in 10 years. All these places, they don't go to Oakland. I don't know how Oakland fixes that. I don't blame Major League. And I'm with you. I used to live in Vegas, and it is a tough baseball market. You're going to have to work the corporate side. You're going to have to work the out-of-town crowd, and you're going to have to develop some kind of base there. And that is going to not be easy. I mean, you look at Miami is the second worst attended team, and I don't know how they fix that. Right. So those are my thoughts on this. It's not going to be easy, and maybe it doesn't work, but I don't think it was ever going to work in Oakland. It took too long.
I mean, you I think all of what you're saying would make a little more sense if the owner of the team wasn't worth $2.5 billion. I like to think that if I had that kind of money laying around, I would spend what it took to keep the team where it's been for 50 some years.
Yeah.
I realize that I don't have that kind of money. And if I did, I probably wouldn't feel the same way about spending it on various things. But it's a difficult case, I think, to make to fans when the owner is saying, we can't afford to stay here. Meanwhile, his net worth is, it's a matter of public record, essentially. So it's a tough argument to make. You kind of wish at some point the owner, well, it wouldn't make it better, but the owner could come out and say, hey, you know what? I just want to make as much money as I can possibly make to add to this stack I already have. And I can't add as much if I stay here as if I leave. And instead, everything has to be couched for year after year about, well, we want to do the right thing no, you don't really want to do the right thing for the city. You want to increase the value of your holdings. Let's just be honest about that, like most business owners would be.
How is this different than Carl Pohlad? I mean, here's another guy that's a loathsome billionaire who, and you and I both know, made his money primarily foreclosing on farms in Minnesota, right? And they struggled to figure it out. So is this a good proxy for that? And then Minnesota ultimately figures it out. And maybe because Minnesota is the only game in town. I don't know.
Well, there is a massive, incredibly expensive football stadium right there in Minneapolis. It's not massive, and it wasn't terribly expensive baseball stadium a mile or two away. I don't actually know how all that got done. Pohlad essentially threatened to get rid of its own team. You probably remember this was back in 2001 when Major League Baseball, Bud Selig, in my career, one of the strangest things that happened was Bud Selig calling my house to complain about something I'd written. And it was essentially about the Twins and contraction. And Pohlad was, at that point, if I'm recalling correctly, the richest owner in baseball, not including the team. His outside holdings, his wealth was the largest in all of baseball at that point. And yet he was saying, oh, I can't afford to continue doing business in Minnesota. We might have to get rid of my team. I think the idea is we've got to get rid of two teams. The Twins essentially volunteered along with the Expos, who I think at that point were owned by Major League Baseball. I wrote many times with a lot of vitriol about all those people. And I frankly didn't believe that the Twins were ever going to be contracted. It was all a bargaining tactic. They were threatening contraction, but wouldn't actually do it because it didn't make any sense. Minnesota was a good market. Pohlad had all the money in the world. Why would that happen? But imagine if you're a Twins fan and for a devout is probably a better word, because for a lot of people, their teams are a sort of religion. A devout Twins fan, the owner of your team, the one that you obsess over for hundreds of hours every year, says, sorry, I can't afford to do this anymore. So we're just going to stop. We'll just go away. Pohlad is one of the best examples of an owner who did not take the public spirit into account. I think his children did a better job afterward, and they figured out a way to make that stadium work. I think they put some money into it. I think probably the state and the city did. They didn't build a ballpark village. They just built a ballpark. That's all it is. Yeah. Have you been there? Yeah. It's just
no, I'm not. There. I'd love to go check it out.
It's in a relatively small footprint, surrounded by other buildings and roads and railroad tracks. I think it's the smallest footprint
other than Wrigley. I think
it might small. Well be. I had the architect on my podcast a few months ago, and we talked about it a little bit. And it's a small foot. They figured it out, and everybody loves that stadium. I don't know who gets the credit for it. The Pohlads. I don't even remember if Carl Pohlad is still alive when that got built, but hey, good for them. It can work. It probably helped that they wanted to be there. I don't get the impression that John Fisher really wants to be in Oakland for whatever reason.
I will say this in John Fisher's defense: Finley, the Haas family, shot the shot, and the other guy's names escape me right now. And then Leo Wolf, all these guys are like, I am done, right? Like, just cannot do it. And they've all said limited revenue means limited budget.
Right.
And I'm not making excuses for billionaires, but it's awfully easy to blame the billionaire and get pissed off at him. And if John Fisher is the next guy in line, and he helped save the Giants, he had a smaller role, but he was one of the guys that did that. So I get that people are mad at him, and I understand it's easy to pick on the billionaire, but what was he supposed to do? And when Major League Baseball's like, here is the path to get out of here, and they follow that path, and the Oakland can't figure out a deal in time, I just can't. I can't blame him. And the one thing that I have seen is I hope maybe you can get Dave Stewart. Maybe you've had Dave Stewart in your show. I've not seen it yet, but I think Dave Stewart is very candid about this. And Dave is an Oakland A. He's not remembered as being a Dodger or Ranger. He's remembered as being an Oakland A. And now he's trying to be the guy with the Nashville Stars. And he's very matter of fact. He's like, Oakland is not the market anymore. Things have changed. It's going to be Las Vegas, and then that's going to give us a chance to get our team in Nashville. And it's like, it's about business for him, and I think we can't lose sight of that. And what else? I also want to say this thing too, and then I'm going to shut up and give you space. But my buddy Tim Fitzgerald was on here, and Tim is from St. Louis originally. He's a Bay Area guy now, but St. Louis did a number on their fans, and they're like, oh, you know what? You can't build a stadium. Hey, Southern Illinois is going to build us a stadium, and they're like, we found money. Right. and I was having a conversation with someone on Twitter, and they were talking like, would anybody ever replace Fenway? And I'm like, I remember when they almost did. They looked at that as a viable option. They're like, they would never do that. And I'm like, here's how you replace Fenway. You say, we're going to move to Vermont or Connecticut or Foxborough. And all of a sudden, Boston will find the ground. They'll find the space for it, and they'll do it, because you can say that park is obsolete. We've spent hundreds of millions to update it. We're not going to do it again. It's cheaper to just start again. And as much as it's an old cathedral, so was the Boston Garden. And people will lament about it being gone, but they'll go to the new place, and it will be the new place, and they will move on,
Right.
And that's just how it is. So in general, I don't know. I mean, I understand the fans who are really like sell, but I don't see anybody in Oakland or in the Bay Area lining up and knocking on Fisher's door to be the next owner in line to have a problem.
Well, I certainly agree with that. Granted, the A's are still worth many hundreds of millions of dollars.
Yeah.
No matter what their stadium situation is, because that so many people with billions of dollars. There are a lot of billionaires in this country, as you know.
Yeah.
There are way more billionaires now than there were 20 years ago.
Yes.
Which means there are way more people with way more people who aren't famous who would like to be famous and can afford to buy into the club.
Yeah.
But there aren't that many club memberships available.
And They got to be accepted by the club.
Well, yes, that's true. That bar is not, as we've seen in especially football and other sports, that bar is not that high. I mean, yes, you have to be accepted, but how many horrible owners have we seen in major sports? Like, so horrible that they got forced out after X number of years, right? Did those people get worse once they got the team? No, they just weren't vetted properly in the beginning. And that's because most sports owners don't want to set the precedent of limiting who can spend the most money for a team, because guess what? I might want to sell my team someday. I don't want my partners telling me I can't sell to that guy because he discriminated against someone in his business 8 years ago, right?
Yeah.
So for the most part, money's always going to win out.
What else do you want to get into? We have a little bit of time left, and I don't want to take all of it and drive the whole conversation. What's interesting to you?
I would say the most, when we look back in 20 years, I think by far the most interesting story in 2023 was the amazingly obvious transformation of 3-hour and 10-minute baseball games into 2-hour and 40-minute baseball games. It was bizarrely, to me, there were still people 6 months ago saying, oh my gosh, you can't do that to my beloved game. You can't put a clock on it. That's
Yeah.
not baseball anymore. Well, yeah, it turns out you can. It's still the same game, but way better. I mean,
Yeah.
we really haven't changed the game at all. There's still too many strikeouts and home runs, in my opinion, aesthetically. But ask 100 fans, would you rather see this game that we all know and love with all the home runs and all the strikeouts?
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to watch that in 3 hours and 10 minutes or 2 hours and 40 minutes? I would
Yeah.
be willing to bet you that 99 of those people, 95, between 95 and 99 are going to say, oh, 240, please.
Yeah.
I don't need that extra half an hour for exactly the same sport, right? It seems so obvious now. And, that's why it was so frustrating, because I like to think I knew how obvious it was for quite a while. I wrote in my book that came out 5 years ago about all this. And it was shocking to me that it was taking everyone so long to realize. And when we say everyone, basically the players, because the players resisted this change for so long, which is another, you look back at this now and say, why are we letting the players run the game? That's really foolish, right?
Yeah.
Who should run the game? Well, the people who are paying money should run the game. The people who are paying the players, the people who are paying the owners in terms of buying tickets. Why would you let the people you're paying, i.e. the players, why let them determine how the game is played and how long the games are? It made zero sense. And you might remember this, but the Players Association put out a statement last spring. We don't agree with this change. We weren't consulted. We totally disagree with these new rules, but we don't have a choice, so I guess we'll go ahead and go along with it.
Yeah.
I mean, come on.
Yeah.
Everyone likes the game better now than they did 6 months ago, right? Attendance is up. I haven't heard anyone all season say, no, I prefer the 3 hours and 10-minute version.
Yeah.
It's crazy that we did
it's way better
for so long.
Yeah.
So that's the story this season, I think. You have all these great player stories and statistics, and Shohei Ohtani, before he got hurt, would have been probably the biggest story of the year, potentially a triple crown and Cy Young Award winner. That would have been the story. But once he got hurt, to me, the shorter games became the story.
What's his value next year? What's your? It's such a wild guess, but
I don't think it's a wild guess. I think I would just look at his hitting stats for this year, his rate stats, lop off 10% for regression to the mean, and he's an MVP candidate as a hitter, most likely. But he's not going to pitch, and I think it's unlikely after 2 Tommy Johns that I think we saw the very best that we would
for sure
see this season, and it's just a shame we couldn't see it for 6 months,
right?
Because it would have been awesome.
And put some performance clauses in there, like if it works out, and we're not against you trying, but let's.
I love those discussions. Like I've actually I didn't even click on any of the links or watch any of the videos because I feel, what are we talking about? Does this impact his value on his? Of course, it impacts his value on his contract. Are you kidding me?
Yeah, he's not going to get a $500 million contract. Like that's just. He is not a guy who has been durable. We can say that.
Right.
So he can't sell durability. And he can sell youth, he can sell brilliance, but he can't sell being on the field. And maybe someone will come along and give him a $500 million contract, but they have to go sell the ads to cover that.
Right. And maybe there's a way to do that.
And not cover it and make money on it, because they're not going to go like they're whatever it is, $750 million they have to make that make sense. And that gets hard.
He has to, for that kind of. Well, I mean, you can run through the math, and the math is hard because it's hard to factor ticket sales into the math because it depends on the market and past performance of the team and how much you're going to put into that marketing. We've seen with the Padres, for example, that they make money just by spending money, right? They prove that. They don't have to win a World Series to get fans to come to the ballpark. What they have to do to get fans to come to the ballpark is go out and sign a bunch of exciting players. People will come just for that. At least they have. But I don't know that Ohtani coming off Tommy John surgery is all that exciting.
And again, we've probably seen the best that he's got to offer.
Right. So the idea that somehow he has as much value now as he had 3 months ago, it's silly. Of course he doesn't.
Yeah. 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 If I was going to change one thing in the game, I'll start. You can go next. You remember back in the 80s when they would show the picture in picture and it would be Vince Coleman or God, I miss guys like Willie Wilson who you're just like, I don't care what he does. I just want to see him run.
Right.
I wrote a thing about him on Twitter, where like he would round the bases and he would impossibly lean over, you're like, I cannot believe how far he would lean. But I want to see like some of that augmented reality stuff where like his lead is now 12 feet, which and give me some of that data and do the picture in picture so that there's some tension on the screen. Acuna is going to steal 70 bases. Show me that and give me some data so I can see how exciting that is because they don't do that. And like Freddie Freeman has stolen 22 bases. All right, well, picture in picture that dude. Let's see what it looks like. And we have all of these bases being stolen. Tell me that story on the screen, and I think that there'll be more engagement there.
That's a great idea, which hadn't occurred to me. There's a reason why it hadn't occurred to me. Well, there's probably multiple reasons. There's one in particular, but I wonder if that's not happening because broadcasters essentially forgot about stolen bases.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because you're right. I remember, I'm old enough to remember what you remember.
Yeah.
And there were some guys, Ricky Henderson, Willie Wilson, Tim Raines.
Oh my God. Yeah.
Um,
Omar Moreno. Like,
Vince
he's
Coleman.
got 2 feet out of the sliding box. He's got both feet on the turf,
Yeah, they would very specifically show those guys in that picture in picture and talk about, he's got his foot on this. He's got to go now. And by the way, that would be way easier to figure out how to do well now because we have all the metrics that tell us exactly pop times for catchers, delivery time for pitchers. When a guy makes 2 pickoff throws, right? The third one, if he doesn't get the guy, it's a violation. So you can pretty much bet that the guy is going to be running this time. So they should do that. This had not even occurred to me in part because I'm going to admit something. I have not watched a baseball game on TV in 2023.
Wow.
And there are a few reasons for that. But the biggest is that having grown up when I grew up, I have a tough time with all the bells and whistles that have been added to the broadcast since then. All the ads behind the batter, I find distracting. The shoulder patches for sponsors drive me insane. The reporters in the stands talking to fans and family members, all that stuff for me detracts from the viewing experience, which again, I realize that's me and I understand that people probably like it. And if you grew up with it, you don't mind it, etc. But the only way I can really enjoy a baseball game at this point is either go to the stadium or listen to the radio broadcast where I get to sort of create my own experience, right? I don't have to be looking at, in the ballpark, you have the ads on the display boards.
Yeah.
But I'm able to filter those out. But when I'm watching a game on TV, what I get to look at and listen to are whatever the people in charge of the broadcast choose to show me. And I have a tough time with it. So I'll probably watch a few postseason games. But the picture in picture stuff wouldn't even have occurred to me because I don't watch pictures anymore.
Yeah. I wouldn't mind also because we have the capacity now to see more combinations of broadcast teams and versions of that. We can do that. And look, I love all these different things, but really we're not bound by 2 or 3. The Dodgers have all kinds of combinations. It's kind of crazy, but let a person license for low cost because it only benefits you. Let them license the right to make their own broadcast. And why not?
You're right. That is the next level, and that would probably bring me back if I could choose my own adventure.
Yeah, or make your own adventure.
Make your own adventure, right? The other
thing, you get the Saber broadcast of the game of the week.
I did one of those.
Wow.
I did one of those. I did a playoff game in. Wow, I should know what year it was. I want to say the Phillies and the Giants were playing a postseason series, but that might well be wrong. I did a sabermetrics, an analytics friendly broadcast with CJ Nitkowski, Bud Black, and Gabe Kapler.
Oh, that's great.
For Fox, one of Fox's second networks, and it was a blast. And I know those happen now. They're alternate broadcasts, which I think are there should ideally more of those. But that's the wave of the future, to the degree that teams can afford to do them. I think with the local broadcasts, it's tougher. I mean, it seems like the teams can barely afford to do a broadcast as it is. It's amazing to me. There's still one or two teams that don't even send broadcasters on the road anymore.
Yeah, just outsource that. Outsource it.
Yes.
Like I'll do whatever it is. I have no idea what the number should be. $150 a month, and you can have your own broadcast team.
And there are so many cameras out there in every stadium now that
pick your feed. I can have my own technical director, and you guys can run the ads. I'll get a tiny share based upon what I push. Whatever. Can I ask you one more thing?
Sure.
Okay, so when I think about when you measure greatness, when people always talk about the greatest of all time, I think there's no real point in that, but since it's a conversation people want to have, I want to have it with them. And once you get above the level of greatness, there's certain things that Pete says that you have to consider. So obviously there's the amplitude of the greatness. Like Mike Schmidt is obviously great, but it's 15 years at third base. And outside of that, he's either playing first or he's just not playing.
Right.
Brooks Robinson plays 23 years. Now, not all 23 are great. And so you have that, but there's a lot longer of a time there. So is he hitting 500 home runs? No, but is Mike Schmidt hitting 30, however many, 3,000 hits like Adrian Beltre? No, right? And so when you look at like someone like Derek Jeter, who gets on base as often as Willie Mays, has total bases on par with Ted Williams. Ted Williams and Derek Jeter are peers in getting on base and total bases, which is insane, right? Different levels in terms of their quality per swing. But Derek Jeter, just like I said, 90% of the games at short during his career, he was standing there. That's remarkable. So longevity, there's that it factor that Derek Jeter had. People love Brooks. George Brett had that thing. When you think about being the greatest at a position, and we're talking like we're eliminating all of the people. We're not talking about A-Rod because didn't play long enough at third or short. You're not talking about other players. You're talking about you're lasered all the way in at the end of the bell curve with the really great people. What matters to you? Is longevity important? Is amplitude important? Is it the most MVPs? Is it World Series titles? I would say that Keith Hernandez is a great first baseman, maybe top 25. Should he be in the Hall of Fame? Yeah, probably, because there's been 23,000 players in baseball, and the top 25 at any position should be there. We're probably too rough on catchers because you can't even play a full season at catcher, right? And so Jason Kendall should probably be in. AJ Przinsky should probably be in just because it's just too hard to play, right? So these are my questions in terms of like understanding what greatness looks like and how do you measure it?
Well, this takes me back to your first question an hour plus ago, because there's a lot to unpack there. And I think that there aren't good objective answers to any of those questions. We all have to make our own decisions. If you and I, two people who probably approach a lot of these things the same way or roughly the same way, if we were to make a list of the 100 greatest players in history, we'd probably come up with a lot of the same guys, but you might have someone ranked 13th, and I might have the same guy ranked 28th.
Yeah.
Justifiably. So it's tough. I think that longevity, I've never thought about it quite like this before, but I almost think that if we're talking about the greatest shortstops, longevity wouldn't be at the top of my list. But if we're talking about the greatest Yankee, it would be. You could talk about, put Derek Jeter in the context of his competition, by the way, for greatest shortstop ever is basically Cal Ripken and Hannes Wagner. Well, Guess what? Both those guys also played their entire careers for one team.
Yep.
So Ernie Banks actually only played half his career at shortstop. So for me, he doesn't fit into that conversation.
Right.
So I'm not sure if those are great examples. I mean, Hernandez maybe is an interesting one because he had some really good years with the Cardinals, with the Mets, not so much with the Indians and whoever else he played for. That might have been it. I can't remember. There was somebody else in that mix. But you know, to me, what I'm looking at for greatest player to position is essentially how much value did he bring to his teams that we're able to measure, and not so much how much value did he bring to his teams in terms of fan interest and all that sort of intangible stuff.
Right.
I had another thought there that I was gonna that I had, but one thing I would look at that is almost always ignored, with a few exceptions, is postseason value.
Yeah.
How much value is, let's say you have a huge World Series. Basically, you are you're the biggest reason why your team won a World Series. How valuable is that to your team, to the franchise, not just in that year, but in all the years after that? How many kids in that city became baseball fans because you hit 3 big home runs?
Yeah.
Right. David Ortiz, to me, was, at least for a long time, a marginal Hall of Famer based on his regular season statistics. But you add the championship value that he added.
Yeah.
Kurt Schilling is another one. I don't like talking about Schilling because he's such a terrible person.
Yeah.
And frankly, I wouldn't, if I was a Hall of Fame voter, like a writer, I would have stopped voting for him because he basically said it's okay to lynch writers, which to me is disqualifying. Just me. If it's not for you, I totally understand, but for me, it would have been disqualifying.
Yeah.
I probably wouldn't vote for a guy who said, "Yeah, go ahead and kill that person."
Yeah.
And I realized it was a T-shirt, and you said it was a joke, but again, that's my opinion. Having said that, before that happened, he would have been, for me, an easy first ballot Hall of Famer because of the championship value that he brought, not to one, 2 teams. The Diamondbacks don't win without him.
Right.
The Red Sox don't win without him. And you add that on top of his already impressive regular season statistics, and it was an easy call. And to be frank, I would have a tough time having a conversation with the writers who didn't vote for him on that first ballot. Before he established himself as a terrible person, he was a clear Hall of Famer, and he should be in there right now. He isn't, and I'm not upset about that, but I would have been pretty upset. I was upset with the writers who didn't vote for him initially.
Yeah.
And very few players have gotten credit for their postseason value, and that doesn't make any sense to me. A few have, but most have not.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Derek Jeter making that play against the A's. I still don't know if Jeremy Giambi is out or safe, but I know that the Yankees are the champions that year.
Right.
And Derek Jeter shouldn't be there, but he was.
Well, that goes back to the everything counts part, right?
Right. Yeah.
Derek Jeter's career statistics are impressive enough.
Yeah.
And then when you ladle on all the other stuff that he meant to the Yankees, getting back to your question, he might be the number one shortstop ever if you give him credit for the postseason and for being a team leader to whatever degree he was. I don't know that he was. He wasn't a vocal team leader. I'm sure some of his teammates would say, yeah, he was a rock. He certainly deserves some credit just for keeping his head about him amidst all the stuff that happens when you're with the Yankees for all those years, right? So, again, this is the fourth time I'll say this: everything counts, and
everything counts.
People who, if you're ignoring things, you're missing an important piece of the puzzle, and it's good to have those conversations, and that's why we don't just want to look at algorithms and wins above replacement.
If everything counts, when Brooks Robinson is standing there at the plate to play third base, and we're looking at the greatest now, right?
Right.
And in his batter's box, Mike Schmidt is not standing there. That must count then, right? And there has to be not a penalty, but there has to be a benefit for Brooks for being able to be great longer.
Well, I'm not. First of all, I'm not sure he was great for longer. I don't know if you look at. Let's make up some. Let's
Okay.
imagine a baseline.
Yeah.
I would say, like when I look at a player's career.
Yeah.
It's my definition of greatness. It floats between all over the place, but it's somewhere between like 3.5 and 4.5 wins above replacement for a season. I'll bet you anything Schmidt had more of those than Robinson did.
Yeah. They both have 12 years of MVP votes.
Okay, well, so, I could be wrong, actually.
And that's the voting in that era too. So
sure.
How much of that is love affair and all that kind of thing.
Well, there wasn't that much of that. I don't think Brooks Robinson was getting a lot of extra love from the voters.
Yeah.
Some.
Yeah.
Here's something else that counts. The National League throughout those guys' careers was better than the American League. I have no doubt about it.
Yeah.
And I think Brooks Robinson's numbers would have been not quite as good if he'd played in the National League relative to the league, and Schmidt's would have been better in the American League. Again, not a lot, but we're talking about tiebreakers again.
Yeah.
So, but you've inspired me. I'm going to go take a look at those two guys' careers. And
I'm curious because the difference in length, that's one of the things that Jeter has on a lot of those guys. And Jeter's obviously better than Vizquel, who's got the most games. But at some point, you're like, there's value in showing up to work. To Schmidt's credit, I believe more than to Brooks Robinson's credit. But you see the foul ground at the Candlestick? And then from home plate to the back wall of Dodger Stadium back then, 90 feet, the Astrodome. Come on, man. That's those were not easy places. They were not generous to hitters. That's one thing. And I don't want to get into steroids now, but when people like steroids, it's like a univariate. Like, no. 2 different eras of expansion. All new ballparks with sidelines shrunk down. There's all kinds of people working out. It used to be like Brian Downing and Nolan Ryan were the only guys that were here. I'm getting into it now. People, the only guys that worked out. But all of a sudden, you had this new era of people like that second generation, Mark McGwire, guys that worked out. Sure, they had help, but there's all kinds of factors that go into these different things. And to Mike Schmidt's credit, he had to play through an era that was probably, like you said, more challenging because it was better. And had harder ballparks, to my knowledge, during that time because Baltimore and Boston and those places were easier. Anyhow, I don't want to take any more of your time unless you have anything else for me.
No, I don't. This has been great. Thanks.
Man, that was awesome. All right, I'm going to run these credits, and I'll come right back to you.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly.